The breeze coming off the Douro River in the late afternoon is nothing like the wind that sweeps through Sonoma in October. The October wind in Sonoma carries must and fermentation, the dense sweetness of sugar converting itself into something more complicated. Here in Pinhao, the air is slower, older, carrying the scent of ancient schist and wild lavender and a mineral quality the Portuguese call cisto, the dark slate bedrock that gives Douro wines their particular depth and austerity. You cannot manufacture that smell. You cannot engineer it, or trademark it, or coax it from another piece of ground. It belongs to this valley, and no other place on earth. And if you have spent 40 years learning to read land the way other people read faces, you know the difference immediately. I had been sitting on the terrace of my quinta for 3 hours that evening. The sun was doing what the sun does over the Douro at the end of September, which is descend behind the terraced vineyards with a slowness that feels personal, as though the light is reluctant to leave. The hillsides were covered in rows of vines pruned low against the schist, their leaves beginning to turn at the edges, gold bleeding into green. It was the kind of evening that makes a man feel, if not grateful exactly, then at least honest about what matters. My glass of Touriga Nacional sat on the iron table beside me. I had not rushed it. I was 68 years old, and rushing wine had become something I associated with a version of myself I no longer recognized. For 34 years in Sonoma County, I woke before dawn and reviewed irrigation reports before breakfast and lay awake cataloging every variable between the vine and the bottle. I was the kind of man who believed the whole structure would fail the moment he stopped watching. That man left his work boots in a garage on a vineyard that no longer carried his name on the deed. He does not live here. Here, I was simply Henry, the retired American who could explain the difference between the terroir of the Baixo Corgo and the Cima Corgo, with the enthusiasm other men reserve for football scores. Here, my rough hands were the hands of someone who had made something real, rather than someone who had failed to keep up with the times. Here, for the first time in longer than I can honestly remember, nobody needed anything from me before I had finished my coffee. I was watching a red kite circle above the far ridge when the phone moved on the table. Not a ring. A vibration. The kind that travels through iron before the sound has time to follow. I looked at the screen. Patricia. I had not spoken to my ex-wife since I signed the final transfer documents 8 months earlier. I had not spoken to my son Owen since a morning in a coffee shop near the university, when he said things across a small table that I have spent considerable effort trying to file away in a place I do not visit often. I had assigned Patricia's number to a separate folder on my phone. Not blocked. I told myself it was not blocking. It was simply organizing. I looked at her name on the screen for 4 full seconds. The kite had found a thermal and was rising without effort, climbing higher above the stone terraces. The light on the far hillside was shifting from gold into amber. My wine was waiting with the patience that good wine has when you have not yet earned the right to drink it. I picked up the phone. I did not say hello. I pressed the green icon and held the phone to my ear and said nothing at all. The sound that came through was not a voice. It was what happens to a voice after it has been crying past the point of tears, reduced to something ragged and formless, the way a piece of cloth comes apart at the seam when the tension has been held too long in one direction. Underneath it, other sounds. People speaking sharply. A door. Something in the distance that could have been a siren. Henry. The word arrived in pieces. Henry, you have to help us. I rested my elbow on the arm of the chair. I looked at the river moving below. They are arresting him. Her breathing came in the broken, shallow rhythm of someone whose body has forgotten its own pattern. They have a warrant. They are taking everything. He is not who we thought he was. Owen is on the floor, Henry. He fell and he will not get up. Please. Tell them you still have a claim on this property. Tell them they cannot do this to us. I lifted my glass of wine. I held it toward the last of the light for a moment, studying the color, the way I have always studied color, looking past the surface to what the growing season left behind. It was deep and dark and honest in the way that certain wines are honest. without effort or design. "Patricia," I said. My voice was steady. "I want to be clear about that steadiness, because I understand how it might be misread as cruelty. It was not. It was the specific kind of calm that arrives only after a long education in what cannot be undone. A man does not find that composure by accident. He earns it the way a vine earns its depth, by sending roots into difficult ground, year after year, until the hardest layers finally give way and something permanent takes hold below the frost line." "Do you remember what I used to say about terroir?" I asked. "Henry, this is not the time for a lecture about wine. We are being destroyed. You cannot fake terroir, Patricia. The land always tells the truth eventually. People rarely manage it, but the land is reliable that way." She said my name again, smaller this time. The way people say a word when they realize it is not going to save them. I placed the phone face down on the iron table. The river ran below in the failing light. A small wooden boat moved through the current with the unhurried confidence of something that had always known exactly where it belonged. To understand why I did that, why I set her voice aside, the way you set aside a bottle that has already turned, you have to go further back than that phone call. Not to a courtroom. Not to a lawyer's office. Not even to the last conversation I had with my son when he told me not to contact him until I was ready to apologize for being who I was. You have to go back to a Tuesday in October. To a kitchen table cleared of everything except a manila envelope and 34 years of things we had both stopped saying. To a woman standing at the window with a look in her eyes I had never seen before and have not been able to stop seeing since. You have to go back to the night it ended, so you can understand exactly how it was always going to end. The Sonoma Valley in October smells like the end of something good. The air carries fermented sugar and decomposing leaves, and the particular sweetness of grapes left too long on the vine. Fruit that has passed its optimal moment and is beginning, slowly, to give itself over to something else. I had always loved that smell. It was honest in a way that most things are not. It told you exactly where in the cycle you were standing, and it did not ask your opinion about it. I came back from checking the upper blocks at 5:30 that evening. The light was going flat and gray the way it does in Sonoma in mid-October. The golden season over, the long brown pause before the rains beginning. My truck was dusty from the access road. My boots were caked with the red clay that sits on top of the bedrock in our oldest blocks, the same clay that had given us 30 harvests of the kind of Pinot Noir that wine journalists described with words like restraint and authenticity, and occasionally, profound. I had never required the journalists to validate what I already knew about the land, but I did not begrudge them the exercise. The kitchen light was on when I came through the back gate. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the silence. Patricia ran the television in the late afternoon without fail. The particular background noise of a household that has run out of things to say out loud and fills the space with other people's voices instead. That evening there was no television. There was only the kitchen light, steady and still, and the silence underneath it. I pulled off my boots at the door. I hung my jacket on the hook I had installed there myself, at a height that worked for my frame, because I had measured it myself and hammered the anchor myself, and I had done it right the first time. I walked into the kitchen in my socks. The table had been cleared. Not cleaned in the way a table is cleared after dinner, with a wipe and a straightened chair. Cleared in a deliberate way. Everything removed. Nothing left on the surface, except a manila envelope placed precisely in the center. The kind of envelope that arrives in the mail when something legal is happening to you. Patricia was standing at the window that faced the side yard, looking out at the rose beds I had built the irrigation for 3 summers ago. She was wearing the blue cardigan she saved for occasions. Her back was to me. She did not turn around when I came in. I looked at the envelope. I looked at her back. I put my keys on the counter where I always put my keys, on the ceramic dish my son had made in a pottery class when he was 9 years old, misshapen and glazed an uneven turquoise, and one of the few things in the house that I was certain no one would ever throw away. "Patricia," I said. Is something wrong? She turned around then. I had known Patricia Calloway for 38 years and been married to her for 34 of them. In that time, I had seen her face in most of the configurations a human face makes when enough life has passed through it. I had seen her afraid. When Owen was sick at 7. I had seen her furious. When the insurance company denied a claim we needed. I had seen her happy. Genuinely happy, in the first years, and then in certain moments afterward, when something she did not expect came along and caught her off guard. What I saw in her face that evening I did not recognize. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was something that had been organized over time, rehearsed, brought to a kind of final form. It was the face of a decision that had already been made and was now simply being delivered. I want a divorce, Henry. I stood there in my socks on the kitchen floor I had refinished in 2011. The words landed somewhere in the middle of the room and sat there. 34 years. We had raised a child. We had survived 3 failed harvests and a wildfire that came within 4 miles of the property and 2 recessions and the slow renegotiation of what we were to each other. That happens to every marriage, whether the people inside it acknowledge it or not. We had paid off the land. We were supposed to have more time. I asked her why. She crossed to the table and touched the envelope with one finger, not pushing it toward me, just acknowledging it. Because I am disappearing, she said. Because I have been disappearing for years, and you are too busy counting barrels to notice. Because I met someone who sees me. His name came out a moment later. Dominic Chase. I did not know the name. She explained him to me the way you explain a new product, efficiently and without ambiguity. 48 years old. He ran a lifestyle brand out of a studio in San Francisco, a podcast called Living Elevated that had several 100,000 subscribers, an Instagram presence she described as aspirational. He had been talking, she said, about what the Calloway property could become. Not a winery, an experience, a destination. The Ibiza of Napa, he had called it. He bought me a Porsche, Henry, she said. When was the last time you bought me something that was not a piece of equipment for this farm? I looked at the envelope on the table. I looked at the window behind her, where the rose beds were disappearing into the dark outside. I thought about the rootstock in the upper block that I had been grafting for 11 years to develop something no other vineyard in California had. I thought about the Michelin distribution contract we had signed the previous spring, the one that guaranteed placement in 47 3-star restaurants across Europe. I thought about the underground cellar I had built by hand in 2003, the one that nobody in this house had ever shown any interest in until this moment. Then I heard the front door open. Owen came in the way he always came in, which was as though the house had been waiting for him and was relieved at his arrival. He shook his jacket off and dropped it on the chair nearest the door, the chair I had asked him not to use as a coat rack for approximately 9 years. He was 27 years old and moved through the world with the ease of someone who had never been required to read the weather before deciding whether to go outside. He looked at me standing in the kitchen in my socks. He looked at his mother by the window. He did not look surprised. He did not look uncomfortable. What he looked was ready, the way a person looks when they have rehearsed the scene they are about to walk into. He crossed to the counter and opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. He drank from it standing up, leaning against the counter with one ankle crossed over the other, watching me with an expression I can only describe as patient, as though he had been waiting for this particular evening for some time and was glad it had finally arrived. You already knew, I said. It was not a question. Owen set the water bottle down. He looked at Patricia, and something passed between them, a confirmation of some kind, the quiet signal of people who have had the conversation you are only now being invited into. Yeah, he said. Mom told me a few weeks ago. I've met Dominic. He's good people, Dad. He's actually really good people. I stood very still in the middle of my kitchen. The kitchen I had gutted and rebuilt in the second year of our marriage, when we still had more ambition than money. And I did the framing myself on weekends. And Patricia painted the cabinets. and we thought that making something with your hands was one of the better things two people could do together. The countertops were the same ones. Butcher block. I had planed and finished them myself. They had 30 years of use in them, and they would have 30 more. Dominic is a developer, I said. He has declared bankruptcy in 2 states. I looked into him when your mother first mentioned his name. Owen's expression shifted, not to surprise, but to something that looked like mild irritation at a point of view he had already dismissed. Dad, he said, successful people fail sometimes. That's how you learn. Dominic has more vision in one conversation than most people have in a lifetime. Vision, I said. Yeah, vision. Owen pushed off the counter and walked to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down in it, making himself comfortable in the way of someone who intended to be there for a while. He wants to fund my label. He looked up at me steadily. $250,000, Dad. Seed investment for the Callaway Owen brand. Small batch Pinot, from the estate fruit, positioned as a next-generation label. Young buyers. Digital-first marketing. He said it's the smartest idea he's heard in the Sonoma market in 5 years. I looked at my son. I had taught Owen to walk the vine rows when he was 4 years old. I had shown him how to read a leaf for signs of water stress and how to taste a berry off the vine and tell from the skin tannin whether it needed another week or was ready now. I had paid for his degree in enology at UC Davis. I had given him a job at the winery and a salary that exceeded what I had paid myself in our first decade of operation, because I wanted him to have the kind of foundation I had not had at his age. I had done all of this because I believed that what we had built on this land was worth inheriting, and that the right person to inherit it was standing in my kitchen telling me about a stranger's money. He calls me a partner, Owen said. He treats me like someone whose ideas are worth something. You've had me pruning blocks and cleaning tanks for 3 years, and you still introduce me as your assistant at trade tastings. You are learning the craft. I said, I'm 27 years old, Dad. Owen leaned forward. I don't want to be learning the craft for another 10 years while you decide when I'm ready. Dominic sees what this place could be. He sees what I could be. He wants to move on it now. Not in some theoretical future when you finally hand over the reins. Patricia had come away from the window. She stood beside Owen now, the two of them on one side of the cleared table, the envelope between us. It occurred to me, looking at them, that this was not a conversation that had started this evening. This was the conclusion of a conversation that had been running for months, probably longer, in rooms I was not in, and during hours, I was out in the vineyard doing the work that paid for the house we were all standing in. I looked at the envelope on the table. I looked at my son. I looked at my wife. I thought about the underground cellar with the vintage collection that no one in this family had ever once asked me to explain. I thought about the distribution contracts with my name on them. Not the winery's name. My name. Because that was how Francois Dubois had wanted it when we negotiated the terms, because he was buying access to what Henry Callaway knew about Pinot Noir and not to a label on a bottle. I thought about the rootstock in the upper block that carried a patent registered in my name and no other name. I reached into my breast pocket. I took out the pen I kept there, a heavy one, well-balanced, the kind that writes without effort when you are signing something you mean. Fine, I said. I pulled the envelope toward me and opened it. I read it the way I always read documents, completely and without hurrying, while Patricia tapped her fingers on the back of Owen's chair and Owen studied his water bottle. When I had finished, I uncapped the pen. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. Henry James Callaway. The signature was clear and unhurried. The signature of a man who had decided something. There is one thing, I said, capping the pen and setting it on the table. Before you start planning, I need to explain exactly what you're getting and what you're not. What I gave them was the farmhouse, the equipment barn, the processing facility, and $200,000 in cash from the joint account. I gave it without argument and without theater. The way you give away things that were always going to be left behind, What I kept was harder to explain to people who had never thought carefully about the difference between what a thing is and what it is worth. The Callaway clone was a rootstock variety I had been developing for 31 years. It was a specific genetic selection derived from old vine Pinot Noir material, adapted through careful work over 3 decades to the particular combination of clay subsoil and coastal fog influence that defined our upper blocks. I had registered the patent on it 9 years earlier, on the advice of an agricultural attorney who told me it was worth protecting. The patent was in my name, not the winery's name, not the name of the trust that held the property. My name. You could take the vineyard. You could not take the clone. The distribution contracts were the same. François Dubois had insisted on structuring them around my personal involvement when we negotiated the terms 4 years prior. He was representing the Michelin distribution network in Europe, and he was buying access to what Henry Callaway knew and did and believed about Pinot Noir. And he wanted that specificity in the language of the agreement. If I left the property, the contracts followed me. If I transferred them, both parties had to consent. Patricia and Owen were not parties. The underground cellar was the third thing. It ran beneath the east end of the processing facility, accessed through a door behind the secondary fermentation tanks that looked, to anyone who had not been shown otherwise, like a utility closet. I had built it in 2003, using reclaimed stone and a local contractor who had since retired and moved away. It held 412 bottles of estate wine going back to our first harvest in 1989. The oldest bottles were worth more per case than Owen's monthly salary. None of them appeared on any document I was signing that evening. I explained all of this at the kitchen table, while Patricia sat across from me, with her hands folded, and Owen studied the middle distance. With the expression of a man listening to an explanation he has decided in advance does not apply to him. So you're keeping some vines and some wine, Patricia said. That seems fine. The property is what matters. I capped my pen. It is, I said. She signed her copies without reading them carefully. Owen witnessed them without reading them at all. I signed mine. I folded my set into the inside pocket of my jacket and put my pen away and stood up from the table I had built and said goodnight to the 2 people who were standing in the kitchen watching me leave their life, which had also, for 34 years, been mine. 3 days later, a rented Ferrari the color of a bruised plum came up the gravel driveway and stopped in front of the tasting room. I was replacing a drip emitter in the second row of the old block when I heard it. I did not need to look up to know it was not someone who belonged on a working vineyard. The sound of the engine was too theatrical, the deceleration too deliberate. Someone was arriving, not coming to work. Arriving. Dominic Chase stepped out of the car and onto my gravel, and I had the specific and unpleasant experience of seeing in person something you have previously only heard described. He was wearing a suit the color of charcoal, well cut but slightly too fitted, the jacket straining across the shoulders in the way of a man who spends more time in the gym than the suit was designed to accommodate. His shoes were white leather, pointed at the toe, the kind of shoe that makes sense in certain rooms and makes no sense whatsoever on a working vineyard in Sonoma County in October. Within 4 steps, they were stained red from the clay. He wore a watch on his left wrist that caught the morning light in a way that suggested its owner intended it to catch the light. I identified the brand from 30 feet. I have seen enough expensive watches on enough people to know the difference between a mechanical movement and a quartz one, and this watch was quartz. The second hand moved in the clipped, ticking steps of a battery-driven mechanism, not the smooth, continuous sweep of a timepiece that had been made to last. "Henry," he said, extending a hand as he crossed the gravel toward me, as though we were old colleagues meeting at a conference. "I've heard so much. Elaine speaks very highly of the operation." "Patricia," I said. "Right. Patricia. Forgive me." He smiled without any apparent effort. The smile of someone who had practiced it past the point where it required any connection to feeling. He looked around at the vineyard, at the rows of old vines and the processing facility and the barn and the farmhouse behind it. with the expression of a man appraising real estate rather than reading landscape. I see what you've built here. Old world. Authentic. That has its own market. For a certain kind of buyer. We went to the upper block because he asked to see the old vines. I showed him the rootstock, the gnarled, low-growing plants that were reaching their 8th decade in this particular piece of ground. I explained what the clay did to drainage and what the fog influence did to ripening, and what 30 years of careful rootstock selection had produced in terms of the vineyard's particular character. He listened with the polite attention of a man waiting for the speaker to finish. "Here is what I see," he said when I was done. He spread one hand toward the old block. "This goes. All of it. You clear this entire section, you grade it properly, you put in an infinity pool oriented west for the sunset view. You run a glamping operation along the ridge. You position it as a wine country retreat. Fully immersive. Minimum 2-night stay. Premium pricing. The Ibiza of Napa. That is where the money is, Henry. Not in barrels of wine that take 3 years to release. The clay soil in this block expands when saturated," I said. "If you grade this section without understanding the water table, your pool shell will crack before the first winter is out." He smiled again. "Details," he said. "I have engineers for details." I drove out of the property an hour later and did not look back until I reached the gate. Then I looked into the rearview mirror. Dominic was standing in the middle of the old block, between the 80-year-old vines, pointing at them with one finger, while Owen stood beside him and nodded. They were having a conversation about something. I already knew what it was about. I pulled onto the county road and did not slow down. The courtroom in the Sonoma County Courthouse smelled of floor wax and the particular brand of stale coffee that exists only in municipal buildings, the kind that has been sitting in a glass pot since early morning and has given up any intention of being good. I had been in this building before, for property filings and permit hearings and the various administrative rituals that accompany owning a working agricultural property for 3 decades. It had never felt hostile before. Rooms take on the character of what happens inside them, and this one had decided it was a place where things got divided. Patricia's attorney was a young man with an aggressive haircut who spoke very quickly and used the phrase, "my client," repeatedly, in the way that lawyers use it, when they want to establish that the person sitting beside them is not responsible for what is about to be requested. He told the judge that my client required immediate liquidity. He told the judge that my client's future financial stability depended on access to the full value of the marital estate. He told the judge that my client was not interested in long-term instruments or deferred assets or anything that required waiting, which I thought was an accurate description of Patricia, in ways that extended well beyond the financial. My own attorney was a man named Gerald Park, who had been handling my affairs for 18 years. He was not aggressive. He was precise. There is a difference. Gerald presented our counteroffer. Henry Callaway will transfer an additional $200,000 in liquid assets to the marital settlement, he said, bringing the total cash consideration to $400,000. In exchange, Henry Callaway retains the land deed as currently held in the Callaway Family Agricultural Trust, along with all associated intellectual property, including but not limited to the Callaway clone rootstock patent, and all existing distribution and wholesale agreements, bearing his name as a contracting party. Patricia's attorney leaned over and said something in her ear. She looked at the number Gerald had written on the notepad between them, $400,000. I watched her eyes settle on it the way a bird settles on a particular branch, not because it is the best branch, but because it is the closest one, and the bird has decided it is done flying. "We accept," she said, before her attorney had finished whatever he was attempting to say. The judge looked at both sides with the expression of someone who has spent enough years watching people make decisions they will spend the rest of their lives reconsidering. She signed the order. I wrote the check in the courtroom, at the table, with my own pen. Gerald slid it across to Patricia's attorney. Patricia did not look at me. She was already composing a text message. I walked out of the building alone into the October afternoon and sat in my truck for 4 minutes before starting the engine. Not because I was upset, because I had learned, somewhere in the middle of a long life, that decisions deserve a moment of acknowledgement before you drive away from them. I had just given away $400,000 and retained the most valuable agricultural intellectual property in my county's wine industry, and the distribution access to 47 three-star restaurants in Europe, and I had done it in front of a judge who thought she was watching a man lose. I drove to the coffee shop near the university because Owen had agreed to meet me there. He was already at a corner table when I arrived, laptop open, the posture of a man who wants you to know he was doing something important before you arrived and is tolerating the interruption. He had a half-finished espresso in front of him, and the particular expression young men wear when they have decided to be reasonable about something they have already made up their minds about. I ordered a coffee and sat down across from him and opened the manila folder I had been carrying under my arm. "I've done some research on Dominic Chase," I said. "I'd like you to look at it before you sign anything." Owen did not close his laptop. He looked at the folder with the specific incuriosity of someone who has been told not to look at something and has decided that not looking at it is a form of loyalty. The folder contained 11 pages. It documented 3 bankruptcy filings across 2 states over a 14-year period. It documented a civil suit filed against Dominic Chase by a restaurant group in Portland who claimed he had taken $230,000 for a wine consultancy retainer and delivered nothing. It documented a complaint filed with the Court of Master Sommelier, alleging that the credentials listed on his professional website had not been legitimately obtained. It documented 6 other individuals who had given Dominic Chase money for projects that had not materialized. I slid the folder across the table. Owen looked at it the way you look at something you have been handed that you intend to put down. "He filed for bankruptcy 3 times, I said. "He took money from a restaurant group in Oregon and disappeared. His wine credentials are fabricated. The people who gave him money before you got nothing back." Owen closed his laptop. He looked at me across the table, and I saw something in his face that I had not expected. Not anger, exactly. Something more deliberate than anger. Something that had been formed before this conversation and was now simply being confirmed. "You're not trying to protect me," he said. "You're threatened by him. Because he has vision, and you never did. Because he sees what the Vineyard could be, and you only ever saw what it was." "Owen," I said. He stood up. He put his laptop in his bag. He straightened his jacket in the way of someone making a final adjustment before leaving a place they do not intend to return to. "Don't call me," he said. "Don't text me. When you're ready to apologize for 30 years of thinking small, you know where to find me. Until then, as far as I'm concerned, you're just the man who used to own the Vineyard." He left. I sat there with my coffee, and the folder open on the table between me and the empty chair. The cafe was warm. Someone nearby was having a conversation about something ordinary. Outside the window, students walked past in both directions, going about the business of their lives. I looked at the folder for a long moment. Then I pushed it to the edge of the table and left it there. Someone would find it eventually. A server would pass it on or throw it away, or a stranger would pick it up and read it and think about what it meant. It was not my job to make Owen read it. I had done what a father could do. The rest was his. I gave myself 1 hour. I had been awake since 3 in the morning, lying in the guest room I had moved into 6 weeks earlier, listening to the particular silence of a house that no longer feels like yours. At 4:30, I dressed in my work clothes, the ones I wore to the Vineyard, because they were what I was most comfortable in, and because it seemed right to say goodbye in the clothes I had always worn to do the work. The valley was dark when I walked out of the farmhouse for the last time. The stars were still visible above the ridgeline, the Big Dipper hanging low over the western hills. The air had that pre-dawn coldness that carries the memory of the night in it, sharp and clean, with the smell of wet earth and the faint mineral edge that rises from the schist when the temperature drops. I had smelled that air 10,000 mornings. I stood in it for a moment with my hands at my sides and simply breathed. Then I walked into the Vineyard. I started at the bottom of the property, at the young block we had planted in 2012, and I walked north through the rows the way I had always walked them. Slowly, touching the wire as I went, checking the wood with my fingers from habit. The vines were dormant now, stripped of their leaves, their canes cut back to the short spurs that would push new growth in spring. They looked, in the darkness, like old hands reaching out of the ground, patient, waiting. I came to the old block last, the oldest section of the Callaway property, the one my grandfather had planted in 1944, the year the war in Europe was ending, and men who had survived things they could not describe were looking for something they could put their hands into and make grow. My grandfather had chosen this particular hillside in Sonoma County because of the soil, because of the way the morning fog came through the gap in the western ridge and kept the vines cool into July. He had chosen it because he understood that what you plant and where you plant, it matters more than almost any decision you will ever make. And that patience is not a luxury, but a technical requirement. I stopped at the oldest vine in the block. It was the one I always stopped at, planted in the spring of 1944, which made it 80 years old and still producing. The trunk, now nearly as thick as my forearm, the bark, rough and deeply furrowed in the way of things that have survived many seasons of difficulty and emerged more themselves for it. I put my hand on the trunk the way my father had shown me when I was 7 years old. You put your palm flat against the wood, and you feel for the temperature of it. Whether it is holding warmth or giving it off, whether it is dormant in the easy way or dormant in the stressed way. My father could tell from this whether a vine had had a good year. I held my hand there for a long time. The wood was cold and utterly still. I went down to the cellar next, through the processing facility, past the secondary tanks, through the door in the back that looked like a utility closet, and opened onto the stone stairs I had built myself in 2003. The cellar was cool and dark, and smelled of the particular combination of stone and wood and slow oxidation that is one of the finest smells on earth. I turned on the low light I had installed for exactly this kind of visit, the kind where you are not working but simply looking. 412 bottles. 34 harvests. I knew each row the way I knew my own handwriting. Knew which vintages had been difficult and which had been generous and which had produced something that neither I nor anyone else had been able to fully explain. I stood in the middle of the cellar for 5 minutes, looking at the racks, memorizing the arrangement the way you memorize a face you may not see again for a very long time. Then I took 6 bottles. I had chosen them in advance, over the previous weeks, in the quiet hours when the house was asleep. The 1989, our first harvest. The 2002, the year Owen was born. The 2007, the vintage that François Dubois had described as the most complete American Pinot Noir he had tasted in 20 years. 2 bottles of the 2017 because it was the best thing this vineyard had ever made, and 1 bottle of the 1996, the year my father died, a harvest so difficult we had nearly abandoned it, a wine that came out the other end of all that difficulty as something quietly extraordinary. I wrapped them in cloth and put them in my bag and turned off the light and walked back up the stairs and through the processing facility and out into the vineyard where the sky was beginning to gray in the east. I put the bag in the truck. I got in. I started the engine, and the old Vate turned over with the steadiness it had always had, faithful and unhurried, the sound of something built to last. I drove down the property road to the gate. I did not stop. I did not look at the farmhouse. I went through the gate and turned left onto the county road and drove. At the first stoplight in town, I took out my phone. I opened my contacts. I went to Patricia's name. I pressed block. I went to Owen's name. I sat with my thumb over it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of the recognition that this was a significant action, and significant actions deserve a moment's acknowledgement. Then I pressed block. At the airport, I checked a single bag and a carry-on and handed my boarding pass to the attendant at the gate, who looked at it and looked at me and asked if I was traveling for business or pleasure. A relocation, I said. Permanent. She smiled and handed back the stub, and I walked down the jet bridge and found my seat by the window and watched California through the glass as the plane taxied and lifted and climbed. The valley floor shrank beneath me, the patchwork of vineyards and orchards and roads becoming a pattern, then a texture, then something abstract. And then the clouds came, and there was nothing below but white. I took out a small notebook from my jacket pocket. I had carried it for years without writing much in it. I opened it to the first blank page and wrote 2 words. Build something. I closed the notebook. I leaned my head back against the seat. The engines held us in the air with the particular steadiness of things, designed by people who understood the physics of what they were doing. But first I thought, closing my eyes, first I need to see how far they are willing to go. I had known Patricia and Owen for 34 years and 27 years respectively. I had a feeling they would not need much encouragement to show me exactly that. The light in Porto is different from the light in California. I noticed it the moment I came through the arrivals terminal and stepped outside, blinking against a brightness that was gentler than I expected, less aggressive, filtered somehow through Atlantic air that had traveled a long way over open water before it arrived here. California light is direct. It lands on things and flattens them, makes them look like what they are, and nothing more. This light did something else. It found the edges of things. The old granite buildings, the river below the city, the tiled facades of the houses on the steep streets leading down to the Ribera district. It made everything look like it had a story worth hearing. I drove east along the river for 2 hours, following the Douro upstream into the valley. The road climbed and curved and occasionally offered views of the water below, deep green and unhurried, moving between the steep schist terraces, the way something very old moves through a landscape that was shaped specifically for it. The terraced vineyards began outside of Regua and continued without interruption to Pinhao and beyond. Row after row of low vines arranged in the precise horizontal lines that the Douro farmers had been cutting into these hillsides for centuries, following the contours of the land with a patience and a geometric intelligence that I found more impressive the longer I looked at it. I had rented the Quinta site unseen, from a listing managed by an agency in Pinhao. It was described as a restored traditional farmhouse with working vineyards on the property and views of the river valley. What I found when I arrived was something more specific and more satisfying than any description could have prepared me for. The building was old stone with thick walls and terracotta roof tiles, and a walled garden at the back where someone had planted rosemary and lavender and a fig tree that was dropping its last fruit of the season into the dry grass. Below, the rooms inside were simple. Good light, wooden floors, a kitchen with a wood stove, and an old oak table that had been in the room for long enough to have become part of it. The first morning I woke at 6 from habit and lay in the bed listening for what the day needed from me. It needed nothing. This took some adjustment. I was accustomed to a life organized around requirement. The vineyard needed checking at first light. The irrigation system needed monitoring. The barrel samples needed tasting on a schedule. The staff needed managing. The accounts needed reviewing. I had spent 40 years as the center of a system that stopped functioning correctly the moment my attention wandered, and I had internalized that responsibility so completely that its absence, in those first mornings in the Quinta, felt less like freedom and more like the particular unease of a man who has forgotten what he sounds like in a quiet room. By the third morning, something had started to ease. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping until 7 without guilt, walking the property's small vineyard after breakfast without urgency, sitting with my coffee on the terrace long enough to watch the light change on the far hillside from gray to gold. I was reading again. Actual books. The kind I had been meaning to read for years, and had always deferred to more pressing obligations. I was cooking in the evenings, not elaborate meals, but the kind of careful, simple food that rewards attention. The village of Pinhao held a market on Saturday mornings in the small square near the train station. I walked down to it in the third week, more from curiosity than necessity. The market was modest by any objective measure. A dozen vendors arranged around the square, selling vegetables and bread and dried herbs and handmade things. What made it worth walking down for was the quality of the attention it received. People were not shopping the way people shop in supermarkets, efficiently, and with their minds already on the next thing. They were talking to the vendors. They were handling the produce. They were taking their time in the way that suggests time is not the enemy. I stopped at a table near the far end of the square that was covered in ceramic pieces, bowls and vessels, and sculptural forms in glazed terracotta. The woman behind the table was 63 or 64 years old, with silver hair pulled back loosely and paint on the back of her left hand that had not quite come off in the washing. She was talking to another customer when I stopped, and she finished her conversation without rushing it before she looked at me. I was holding a wine vessel, a handled jug with a narrow neck that had been glazed in a layered way that made the surface look like the inside of a cave lit from a distance. The form of it was interesting to me, not as a decorative object, but as a functional one. The proportions of it, the way the weight distributed when you held it. I was turning it in my hands, checking the balance the way you check a tool. "You are not looking at the shape," the woman said. Her English was careful and considered. "You are looking at how it holds." I looked up. She was watching me with an expression that was neither unfriendly nor particularly deferential, simply attentive. "I spent 40 years making something designed to hold time," I said. "Old habit." She nodded as though this were a reasonable thing to say to a stranger in a market square. "Wine? Pinot Noir. Sonoma County, California." She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone accessing a particular memory. "Callaway Vineyards?" she said. I set the vessel back on the table carefully. "Yes." She looked at me for a moment. "My husband passed 3 years ago," she said. "He was an importer. He used to bring home bottles for special occasions. The Callaway Pinot was the one he kept for the occasions that mattered most. He used to say it was the most honest wine he had ever tasted." She paused. "He said it tasted like someone had actually meant it." I did not say anything for a moment. The market continued around us. The ordinary business of a Saturday morning in a village that had been here for a very long time. "I am Isabel," she said, and extended her hand. "Henry," I said, and shook it. That evening I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of local Douro Red when the application on my phone produced a sound I had not heard in weeks. Not a call. A notification. I looked at the screen. Rootstock Zone A. Irrigation supply. Manual override detected. Water flow. 0. I set down my glass. I looked at the notification for a long moment. They had started. I had expected it eventually. I had not expected to feel quite so ready. I had not deleted the remote access to the Vineyard management system because I had told myself it was not about holding on. It was about professional responsibility. A man who builds a system does not simply abandon it. He monitors it from a distance the way an engineer monitors a bridge after handing off the maintenance contract, not because he doubts the new team, but because the knowledge of how the thing works does not leave him just because the ownership has. That was what I told myself. It was mostly true. The application on my phone had been installed during the renovation of the irrigation infrastructure in 2018, when I had upgraded the entire property to a sensor-networked system that monitored soil moisture, temperature, water flow, and electrical consumption across 12 separate zones. I had coded parts of it myself, with the help of an agricultural technology consultant out of Davis who described my specifications as unusually thorough. I had kept the administrator access under my own credentials. It had not occurred to me at the time of the divorce proceedings to mention this to anyone, and no one had thought to ask. The notifications began arriving that first week in Pinhao, and continued with increasing frequency over the weeks that followed. I kept a running record of them in the small notebook I had brought with me. Not because I planned to act on them immediately, but because I believed in documentation, the way I believed in keeping proper seller records. You do not always know at the time of writing which information will matter later. You write it down, and you keep it. and you let the story tell you, eventually, what it needs. Rootstock zone. A. Irrigation. Discontinued. Day 7. Fermentation room temperature controls disabled. Day 11. Secondary tank monitoring system unplugged. Day 14. That last one required effort. You could not accidentally unplug the secondary tank monitoring. You had to locate the hardware, understand what it did, and make a deliberate decision to disconnect it. Dominic had either done this himself or instructed someone to do it. Either way, it meant he was not simply ignoring the systems I had built, he was removing them. On the 19th day, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my morning coffee when the application delivered an image notification. The camera I had installed in the underground cellar, the one positioned high on the east wall with a wide-angle lens, had been triggered by motion. I opened the notification. Dominic Chase was in my cellar. He had found the door, which meant someone had told him about it, or he had looked until he found it, and he was standing in the middle of the stone room with 3 men in suits who were not dressed for a working vineyard. He was speaking to them with the expansive confidence of a man conducting a tour of his own property, gesturing at the racks of bottles, pointing out specific sections the way a collector points out pieces he is particularly proud of. I watched him take a bottle from the 1993 rack and hold it to the light and say something that made the men in suits nod appreciatively. That was one of 15 bottles remaining from a harvest that had been, in my judgment, the most technically difficult we had ever managed. The wine had required 3 years in barrel and had emerged as something that did not have a clear category, something that wine critics had struggled to describe because they had not encountered its particular combination of characteristics before. I had kept those bottles back from all commercial release. They were not for sale. They had never been for sale. Dominic did not know that. He knew only that they existed in a cellar beneath a property he believed he controlled. And that made them, in his understanding of the world, his. I closed the notification and set my phone on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the garden where the fig tree was fully bare now, its branches clean against the gray November sky. I had been in Portugal for 6 weeks. On the morning of the 23rd day, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. San Francisco area code. First Bay Bank of California. Robert, I said. Henry. Robert Chen's voice was the same as it had always been, careful and professional, with the particular formality of a man who has been in banking long enough to know that how you say a thing matters as much as what you say. I apologize for calling you abroad. I know you're retired. It's all right, Robert. What is it? I have a loan application on my desk. He paused in the way of someone assembling the right words. It is a home equity credit application against the Callaway Vineyards property. $600,000. The applicant is a man named Dominic Chase. He has submitted a power of attorney document authorizing him to act on your behalf as the property owner. I looked at the river through my kitchen window. The Douro moved past in the morning light, indifferent and unhurried. The way rivers move when they have been moving for long enough to have given up urgency. He submitted a power of attorney with your signature on it, Henry. Robert's voice had dropped slightly. The signature does not match your file signature. And the title search came back with a flag. The property deed is held in a trust, and the trust documents do not grant Mr. Chase any authority over the asset. I know, Robert. He became aggressive when I explained this to him. Robert continued. He told me you had become incapacitated. He told me he was managing your affairs on your behalf. He told me the funds were needed for urgent structural repairs. What kind of repairs? He mentioned a swimming pool. I set my elbow on the table. I am not incapacitated, Robert. The power of attorney is a forgery. I never signed anything of that kind. I assumed as much. I can refer this to our fraud department today, Henry. I can also contact law enforcement. He is sitting in our lobby at this moment. He came in this morning confident the application was ready to proceed. I looked at my notebook, open on the table, with its 23 days of recorded notifications. I thought about the rootstock in Zone A with its water supply cut off. I thought about the bottles of 1993 in the hands of a man who did not know what they were. "I want you to process the application," I said. A silence opened up on the line. "Henry, tell him the appraisal takes 2 weeks. Tell him the credit review is moving forward. Tell him everything looks promising. Make him believe he is 3 days away from having $600,000. You are letting him dig his own hole," Robert said slowly. "I am handing him the shovel," I said, "and making sure he has plenty of time to use it." Another pause. "He is drinking our complimentary coffee right now," Robert said. "He has been here for 40 minutes. I looked out at the Douro, at the light on the water. "Tell him the news looks good," I said. "Tell him to enjoy the weekend." I paused for a moment. Watching the current move below the Quinta, he is going to want to remember it. The call came on a Thursday morning when I was reading at the kitchen table. A book about the geology of the Douro Valley that I had found in the village library and had been working through slowly, with the particular pleasure of reading about something you already understand at a practical level and are now encountering at a deeper one. The morning was overcast. Isabel had texted to say she would be at her studio until the afternoon. I had a pot of coffee and nowhere I needed to be, which still felt, after 2 months in Portugal, like a form of wealth I had not yet fully learned to spend. The number was unfamiliar. An American area code, Davis area, but not a number I had seen before. I looked at it for a moment. I had blocked the 2 numbers I needed to block, but there were other numbers in the world, and one of them could belong to someone who needed to reach me for a legitimate reason. I answered. The screen filled immediately with a face I knew. Owen was wearing sunglasses despite the fact that the sky behind him was the flat gray of a California November. He had the look of a man who has been waiting for an audience and is glad one has finally arrived. He was grinning in the way of someone who believes the news he is about to deliver is good. "Hey, Dad," he said. "I borrowed a friend's phone. Figured since you decided to block me, this was the only way to reach you." He tilted his head slightly. "I thought you might want to see how things are going." He said this with the particular tone people use when they want you to know that things are going very well, and the telling of it is a gift they are choosing to give you. I did not say anything. I held the phone and looked at my son's face on the screen. He flipped the camera. "Look at this," he said. The image was unsteady at first, panning across the Callaway property in a way that gave me a moment of displacement, the sensation of seeing something deeply familiar from an angle that makes it strange. The tasting room had been painted. A large white tent was going up in the area near the processing facility. Workers moving with the focused efficiency of people on a deadline. Strings of lights were being run between poles. There were vehicles I did not recognize parked along the lower access road. "Dominic's grand relaunch is Saturday," Owen said, his voice narrating from behind the camera the way a tour guide narrates when they are confident in what they are showing. 300 guests, wine, music, investors. He has people flying in from Chicago. The Michelin crowd is coming. He says this is going to put Callaway on a completely different map. The camera moved past the processing facility toward the upper section of the property. I felt my hand tighten slightly on the phone. "We had to do some landscaping up here to make room for the event space," Owen said, still narrating, his voice carrying the mild apology of someone describing a minor inconvenience. His tone was the tone of renovation shows on television, enthusiastic about transformation, impatient with sentiment. Dominic wanted a clear sightline from the main tent to the sunset view. The camera reached the old block. The vines were gone. Not pruned. Not cut back for dormancy. Gone. The machinery had come in and gone through the 80-year-old block with the systematic indifference of equipment that does not know what it is removing, that experiences no difference between a 3-decade-old vine and a scrubweed at the edge of a field. The ground was raw and churned. I could see the ends of the roots where they had been torn from the clay, pale against the red-brown earth, the exposed tips of a system that had been growing deeper into that specific piece of ground since before I was born. At the far end of the block, one of the oldest trunks had been dragged to the side and left there, root mass still attached, lying on its side in the November light. The cross-section of the trunk was visible. The growth rings were exposed. I counted them. From the outside in, methodically, the way my father had taught me. You start at the bark, and you work inward, and you count what you find. Each ring is 1 year of growth. 1 growing season, 1 winter, 1 full rotation of the earth around the sun. 80 rings. My grandfather had planted it in 1944. He had watered it by hand the first summer because the irrigation had not yet been run to that section. My father had pruned it for 30 years. I had pruned it for 40. That vine had produced fruit through drought years and smoke-tainted harvests and late frosts, and the particular difficulties that come to any living thing that has been in the ground long enough to have survived many kinds of this adversity. Dominic said those old vines were just taking up space, Owen said. The pool goes in right there. He said it the way people say things that are not important. I looked at the exposed rings in the gray light. You okay, Dad? Owen said. You look kind of pale. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I set the phone face down on the table. Then I stood up and walked to the window and looked at the Douro below. The river was the same as it always was, moving between the schist terraces with its permanent, unhurried intelligence. A heron stood at the edge of the far bank without moving. I stood there for a long time. I let the pain come, because it was real pain, and real pain should be felt, and not managed immediately away. 80 years. 3 generations. My grandfather's hands in the soil in 1944. Then I let the pain do what pain eventually does when you do not panic it away. I let it cool. I let it find its shape. I let it become something else. It was not anger anymore. Anger is hot and imprecise and expensive. What I felt settling in my chest was something different, something with load-bearing capacity, something you could build on. It was the specific cold clarity of a man who has decided that patience has a limit, and that the limit has now been reached, and that what comes next is not reaction, but architecture. I went to the table and opened my notebook. I turned to a fresh page. I wrote a name at the top, Margaret Reyes, FDA Western Region. Below it, I wrote 3 more names. Then I picked up my phone and began to make calls. In winemaking, the harvest decision is the most consequential judgment a vintner makes all year. You have been watching the fruit for months, monitoring sugar levels and acid content and skin integrity, reading the weather and consulting your own experience, and asking the land what it needs. And then there comes a morning when you look at the blocks and you know, not because a number on a refractometer tells you, because you have done this long enough, that the knowledge lives in a place below calculation. You pick, you commit. Everything that follows is the consequence of that single decision. I had been watching for 2 months. Thursday night was the morning I looked at the blocks and knew. Margaret Reyes answered on the second ring, which told me she was still at her desk despite the hour. She was the regional director of the Food Safety and Inspection Division for the Western United States, and she had the reputation, among people in the industry who paid attention to these things, of being the kind of official who reads the fine print, not because it is required, but because she finds it interesting. I had met her at an industry conference in Sacramento 7 years earlier, where she had given a presentation on counterfeit wine labeling that I had found more technically precise than most presentations delivered by people actually in the wine business. I explained the situation without editorial. I told her about the bulk wine purchases Dominic Chase had made through a distributor in the Central Valley, purchases documented in invoices I had obtained through the distribution network. I told her about the Callaway Reserve labels being applied to wine that had not been produced at Callaway Vineyards and did not meet the appellational standards required for the Sonoma Coast designation printed on those labels. I told her about the grand relaunch on Saturday, where this wine would be served to 300 guests, many of whom would be paying for the Callaway name and not receiving it. I can have agents at the event, she said, when I had finished. Do you have documentation you can transmit tonight? I have 11 pages, I said. And I can have 17 more by morning. She gave me a secure upload address. Send everything, she said. Francois Dubois was in Paris, which meant it was early Friday morning there when I called. He was the kind of man who answered early morning calls without irritation because he had arranged his life to run at the tempo of someone who understood that the most important conversations happen outside of business hours. We had worked together for 4 years, and I had come to trust his judgment about wine with the specific trust you develop for people who have spent as long as you have thinking carefully about the same things. I told him what was happening to the Callaway name. I told him about the relabeled wine. I told him that the distribution relationship he had entered into with me personally was being used to give credibility to a product that had nothing to do with what we had agreed to represent. He was quiet for a moment when I finished. "The Callaway clone," he said. "The rootstock. They destroyed it? 80 years of material," I said. "It is gone." Another silence. This time, it felt like something hardening. "Henry," he said, "I will be there on Saturday. Not as a guest. I will have a credential arranged for you," I said. "Do not arrange anything," he said. "I prefer to arrive as myself." I called Sarah Kim at 11 o'clock California time, which was 8 in the morning in Portugal. She was a staff writer at Wine Spectator, who had been pursuing a profile of Dominic Chase for 6 months. A profile that had stalled because her subjects kept recanting their willingness to speak on record. I had heard about her investigation through Francois, who had mentioned it in passing the previous spring, before any of this had started, as an example of the kind of scrutiny the industry was beginning to apply to lifestyle figures who had positioned themselves in the wine world without genuine credentials. I told her what I knew. I told her about the 3 bankruptcy filings. I told her about the civil suit in Oregon. I told her about the sommelier credentials that the Court of Master Sommelier had no record of issuing. I told her about Saturday's event and what would be served at it and who would be there. She asked me if she could quote me by name. "You can use my name for everything," I said. I ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. The Quinta was entirely still. Outside, the Douro Valley was dark and the river was invisible below. But I knew it was there the way you know certain things that are too consistent to require confirmation. I called Robert Chen last. It was 3 in the afternoon in San Francisco. "He is proceeding," Robert said, before I could ask. "He came back in this morning with additional documentation. He has hired a notary. He is acting like a man who has already spent the money." "Good," I said. "Continue as we discussed. Friday appraisal update. Saturday morning signing appointment. And the appointment on Saturday," Robert said. "You want me to honor it?" "I want you to schedule it for 10 in the morning," I said. "And I want your branch manager to be present. And I want everything documented." "Henry." Robert paused. "What is going to happen on Saturday?" "A harvest," I said. "A long, overdue one." I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. The lamp on the desk cast a circle of yellow light across the room, and outside that circle, the house was dark. I was aware of a kind of clarity that I had not felt in some time, the clarity that comes when you have moved from the planning phase to the committed phase, when the decision has been made and all that remains is what follows from it. I heard Isabel's footsteps in the hallway. She appeared at the doorway in the way she appeared at doorways, without announcement, having decided to come and come. "You have not slept," she said. "I am setting the table for a harvest," I said. She looked at me the way she looked at her work when it had reached a point where any additional effort would compromise rather than improve it. She understood threshold moments. Some things, she said, should only be poured once. Then she set a cup of coffee on the desk beside my notebook and went back to bed. I looked at it for a while without drinking it. I poured a glass of Douro Red instead and carried it to the window and stood there in the dark looking at nothing in particular while I thought about a man 10 time zones away who was almost certainly asleep. Dominic Chase, sleeping in the farmhouse that had been my home for 30 years, with $600,000 in his plans and 300 guests in his invitations. And the confidence of someone who had never yet been made to account for the distance between what he promised and what he delivered. "Harvest Saturday," I said to the window. "Let us see what you have actually grown." "The Saturday of the grand relaunch," I sat in the study of my quinta with the shutters open to the afternoon air and 4 security camera feeds arranged across the screen of my laptop. I had a glass of water beside me. I did not want wine for this. I wanted my senses precise and my attention undivided. I wanted to remember everything. The cameras were the same ones I had installed 3 years earlier as part of the property's integrated management system, positioned at the 4 corners of the main structures to monitor access and activity. They fed to my administrator account on a continuous loop. Nobody at the property knew they were still active. Nobody had thought to ask. The image quality was excellent. High definition, wide angle. Updated to 4-hour buffer storage the previous spring. I had paid for the upgrade at the time, without particular foresight. It had turned out to be useful. What I saw on the screen at 4 in the afternoon Pacific time, which was midnight in Portugal, bore very little resemblance to a working vineyard. They had run red carpet across the gravel approach, the deep synthetic red of event rental carpet, and I could see from the angle of the north camera that it was already sinking unevenly into the clay beneath it, the soft ground accepting the weight of arriving guests in the way that Sonoma clay accepts all weight, which is reluctantly, and with consequences. Strings of lights were strung between the event poles at a height and density that suggested someone had decided that more was always better, an approach that produces a certain effect in photographs and a different effect in person. The white tent covered most of the area where the old block had been. Beneath it, tables with white linen and tall centerpieces of eucalyptus and dried grasses, the rustic aesthetic of someone who had researched what wine country events are supposed to look like and reproduced it with the accuracy of a very good replica. I had a microphone pickup on the south pole of the tent, a small device I had installed during the smart home upgrade for ambient sound monitoring. I connected the audio feed and adjusted the volume. The sound that came through my laptop speakers was the sound of a room that had decided it was having a good time. Patricia stood near the entrance of the tent, receiving arriving guests with the practiced warmth of a woman who had spent weeks rehearsing this moment. She was wearing a dress the color of champagne, floor length, with a neckline that required the kind of confidence that borrows from occasion. Around her neck was a diamond necklace that I recognized immediately, not because I had given it to her, but because I had seen it before, in an advertisement for a San Francisco jewelry rental service that caters to events of this kind. You could borrow it for 48 hours for a fee that would have represented 2 months of grocery money for most of the people I grew up around. She was wearing borrowed time around her neck, literally, and she was greeting guests with it, as though it were her own. Dominic Chase stood at the center of the tent beside a champagne tower that had been built to 5 tiers and had not yet been touched. He was wearing a white tuxedo jacket and holding a cigar that he was not smoking, carrying it between his first 2 fingers like a prop, which is what it was. He was talking to a group of 4 men who had the look of people who were being pitched to and knew it and had decided they were interested enough to continue listening. His mouth was moving with the fluency of someone who has said the same things so many times they no longer require thought. I turned up the audio. This region has been underutilized for 20 years, he was saying. The Napa Premium is a brand perception issue, not a quality issue. What we are doing here, what you are standing in the middle of right now, is the correction of a market inefficiency. He paused to let that land. The smart money, gentlemen, is in Sonoma. I looked at the men he was talking to. I did not recognize any of them. That was not surprising. Dominic's network was not composed of people who showed up in wine industry directories. A server passed through the tent with a tray of poured glasses, distributing what had been labeled as Callaway Reserve 2019. The wine that I had watched being sourced through the distribution records, a Central Valley bulk purchase at $8 per bottle, dressed in a label carrying my family's name and a Sonoma Coast appellation that the grapes had never seen. Guests accepted glasses without looking at them, the way people accept things at events when the point is being somewhere rather than tasting something. Near the back left corner of the tent, standing with the particular stillness of a man who is observing rather than participating, was François Dubois. He was wearing a suit that had been pressed that morning and holding a glass he had not touched. He He was watching the room with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone who has traveled a long distance to see something confirmed. Owen appeared at the front of the tent with a microphone. He was wearing a suit that fit him well, and he had his hair done, and he was carrying himself with the confidence of a young man who believes the evening belongs to him. He tapped the microphone twice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice filling the tent with the amplification I had adjusted to hear clearly from a study in Portugal. "If I could have your attention, I want to say a few words about this vineyard, about what it has been, and about what it is becoming." He paused for effect. "I want to say a few words," he said, "about the man who used to stand in the way of all this." I reached forward and adjusted the audio level on my laptop upward by 3 increments. I settled back in my chair. Outside, the Douro ran south through the dark, in no particular hurry. Inside the tent in Sonoma, my son was about to deliver a speech he had been preparing for months. I wanted to hear every word of it. Owen Calloway, my son, 27 years old, stood at the front of a rented tent on the property where I had worked for 34 years and told 200 people what he thought of me. I listened to every word of it from a study in Portugal with the volume on my laptop turned up to the point where I could hear the particular acoustic quality of a microphone in a tent, the slight hollow resonance of amplified sound in an enclosed temporary space. He was a good speaker. I had always known he was a good speaker. It was one of the things he had from his mother: the facility with an audience, the instinct for where the pauses should go, and when to make eye contact with specific people to make them feel included. He had charm. Charm is a tool. Like any tool, its value depends on what you use it to build. "For 30 years, Owen said, his voice carrying cleanly through the tent and through my laptop speakers, this vineyard was a museum. Old vines, old methods, old thinking. No vision, no ambition. Just a very careful man with very small ideas, counting his barrels and telling everyone around him what they were doing wrong." The guests applauded politely. Not enthusiastically, but with the compliance of people who have been given alcohol and are disposed to agree with whoever holds the microphone. I watched Patricia on the camera feed. She was standing to the left of the champagne tower with a glass in her hand and her chin lifted slightly, the posture of a woman who feels she is being publicly vindicated. She was smiling in the specific way of someone listening to their own thoughts being expressed by a better speaker. Dominic was nodding. He nodded the way men nod when they are listening to someone say something they coached them to say. With the satisfied attentiveness of a director watching an actor hit a mark correctly. Owen kept going. He said that I had treated the vineyard like a fortress instead of an opportunity. He said that I had been so focused on protecting what we had that I had never stopped to ask what we could become. He said that Dominic Chase had done in 6 months what I had refused to do in 3 decades, which was to look at this land and see not a responsibility but a possibility. I noticed that he did not mention the 80 years of rootstock. He did not mention the Michelin contracts. He did not mention the fact that every notable thing about Calloway Vineyards that had caused anyone to pay attention to it had come from what I had done with the land before he arrived. He mentioned my truck. He mentioned that I wore the same jacket to industry events for 11 years. He mentioned that my idea of celebrating a good harvest was a glass of estate wine on the porch rather than a party. He was right about those things. I did all of those things. I looked at the second camera feed, the one that covered the interior of the tent from the northwest corner, because something at the edge of the frame had drawn my attention. 2 people were moving through the room in a pattern that was different from the movement of guests. They were stopping at each table, picking up glasses, and holding small collection vials beneath the poured wine, with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this procedure many times. They were wearing event clothes. They did not look like agents of the Food and Drug Administration. That was the point. Margaret Reyes had said she would have people there. She had kept her word. François Dubois had set his glass down on a high table near the back wall and had taken his phone out. I watched him compose something, read it, compose something more, and send it. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and folded his arms and resumed watching the room with the expression of a man who has traveled from Paris to see something specific and is making sure he sees it completely. Owen concluded his speech by raising his glass toward Dominic and Patricia and saying that tonight was not just a party. It was a statement. It was proof that vision, actual vision, not caution dressed up as wisdom, was what separated people who built something real from people who built something they called real while they were standing in the way of something better. He said this to 200 people. He said it into a microphone in a tent on a property whose most valuable intellectual assets were in my name and not his, whose distribution relationships were with a man standing in the back of the room, watching everything with professional attention, whose wine was being collected into sample vials by federal agents while the guests drank it. The applause was louder this time, because Owen had built to it skillfully, and because the champagne had been circulating for 40 minutes. Dominic moved away from the tower after the applause and was immediately surrounded by 4 men who had been waiting for the moment. I watched him shift into the particular mode of a man who operates best when he has a room's energy working for him. He began talking with his hands. I turned up the audio on the south pickup. The Tulum project is the next chapter, he was saying. Eco-luxury. Coastal rights already secured. I have architects in Mexico City finalizing the renderings as we speak. Minimum participation is $75,000 per investor unit. We are capping at 8 participants because I believe in keeping this exclusive. He paused. By the time we open in 18 months, you will all be thanking me. I was watching the 3rd camera feed when the movement appeared at the main entrance to the property. A car had stopped at the gate, a dark sedan, heavy and unhurried. A figure stepped out. He moved through the valet area without stopping, without producing an invitation, without doing any of the things a guest does at an event, because he was not a guest. He walked across the red carpet with the particular gait of a man who has never, in his professional life, felt the need to hurry. He was tall. He wore a suit the color of charcoal. He looked at the tent ahead of him the way you look at an invoice you have been waiting a long time to settle. I did not know Victor Marsh personally. I had found him through the distribution network, through a contact who knew him, through the specific inquiry of a man who has spent a week looking for exactly the right instrument. He held a promissory note from Dominic Chase for $400,000, drawn against assets that Dominic Chase had since spent, for a project that had produced nothing. He had been trying to collect for 5 months. Victor Marsh walked into the tent. The nearest guest stepped aside without being asked. There is a quality some people carry that arranges rooms without words. He stopped when he had a clear sightline to Dominic. "Hello, Dominic," he said. His voice required no microphone. "I heard you were celebrating. I thought I would come congratulate you in person." 200 heads turned. The champagne tower stood untouched to Dominic's left. The 5-tier architecture of it caught the string lights beautifully, each crystal glass reflecting a small version of the evening back at itself. I watched Dominic's face on the camera feed. I watched the smile he had been wearing all evening continue to exist on his face for approximately 2 seconds, after it had stopped being connected to anything underneath it. Dominic Chase was a man who had survived his entire professional life on the ability to reframe. When a project failed, it became a pivot. When a debt came due, it became a renegotiation opportunity. When a room turned against him, he had always found a way to redirect its attention towards something shinier. I had watched him operate for 2 months from a distance, and I understood the mechanism of him clearly. He ran on audience energy, the way certain engines run on the specific fuel they were built for. Remove the audience, and the engine stalls. Victor Marsh was not interested in being redirected. "Victor," Dominic said, stepping toward him with his hand extended, and his voice at full social volume. The voice designed to carry and reassure and reestablish the terms of the room. "I did not know you were in Sonoma. You should have called ahead. We would have arranged a seat for you." Victor Marsh looked at the extended hand without taking it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something offered to him that he has decided is not worth picking up. He put his hands in the pockets of his charcoal suit instead. I tried calling, Victor said. Several times. Over 4 months. You were unavailable. The room had not gone back to its previous volume after Victor's entrance. It had stayed at the lower register of a space where people are listening without appearing to listen, that specific social frequency of a gathering that has sensed something interesting and is waiting to see how it develops. This is not the time or the place, Dominic said, his voice dropping slightly, shifting to the register he used when he wanted to convey that a private matter had intruded on a public one. You borrowed $400,000, Victor said, at normal volume. Without adjustment. He was not interested in the register Dominic wanted. He was establishing his own. You put a property up as collateral that you do not own. You have not answered a phone call or returned a letter in 142 days. People near the edges of the group were no longer pretending not to listen. They were simply listening. Dominic laughed. It was a good laugh, technically. It had the right length and the right quality of dismissal, but something in the room had shifted. And laughter that is technically correct but contextually wrong lands differently than its producer intends. Several of the guests who had been applauding Owen's speech 90 seconds earlier were now looking at each other with the particular expression of people reassessing a decision they had already made. Then François Dubois moved. He uncrossed his arms and stepped away from the back wall and walked through the center of the tent with the specific purposefulness of a man who has traveled from Paris and is done waiting. He stopped 6 feet from Dominic, equidistant from Victor, and he stood there in the string lights with the stillness of someone who does not require the room's permission to speak. "Mr. Chase," he said. His accent was light, French over English, and his voice had the particular quality of authority that does not announce itself. Guests who had not noticed him before noticed him now. "I represent the Michelin Guide Distribution Partnership in Europe," he said. "I represent 47 restaurants in 11 countries that have been purchasing wine under the Callaway name for 4 years." He paused. "Before this evening continues, I would like to ask you a question about the wine being served tonight." Dominic's jaw tightened by a fraction. "I saw it on the camera feed. From the outside, it was nearly invisible. From the inside, I understood exactly what it meant." "Of course," Dominic said. "Ask anything." "This wine," François said, picking up a glass from the nearest table and holding it at eye level, "is labeled as Callaway Reserve, 2019, a Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir." He held it to the light. "Can you tell me, Mr. Chase, where these grapes were actually grown?" The tent was silent. Not quiet in the way that tents are quiet between conversations. Silent in the way that a room goes. Silent when something real has entered it. And everyone in the room has understood simultaneously that the evening has changed. Dominic opened his mouth. Before he could produce a word, a woman near the center of the room stood up from her seat. She had been sitting at a table for 40 minutes with a glass of water and a small case that she had kept beside her chair. She was 40 years old, with dark hair and the composed manner of someone who has done this before and finds it neither exciting nor unpleasant, simply the next required step in a professional process. "My name is Agent Diana Torres," she said clearly. "I am with the Food and Drug Administration, Western Region. My colleague and I have been collecting wine samples from this event this evening, pursuant to a food safety investigation." She nodded toward the second agent, who had stood as well, holding a sealed evidence bag. She looked at Dominic. "Mr. Chase, preliminary field analysis of the samples collected tonight indicates that the wine being served does not meet the appellational standards printed on the labels. We will need to speak with you." At the entrance to the tent, 3 figures appeared. They moved with the coordinated rhythm of people who have entered rooms like this before and understand the geometry of it. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s in a dark jacket. She walked to the center of the tent and stopped and looked at Dominic, the way people look at the specific thing they came a long way to find. "Dominic Chase," she said. The tent was so quiet that the string lights above seemed louder than they had been a moment ago. I have a federal warrant for your arrest. Wire fraud, aggravated food and beverage fraud, and identity theft across 3 states. She produced the handcuffs. She crossed the distance to Dominic in 4 steps. Dominic Chase, who had filled every room he had ever entered with the particular energy of a man who believes he will always find a way out, stood very still. The handcuffs closed. The sound they made was small and precise and final. To Dominic's left, the champagne tower caught the light of the strings above it. 200 crystal glasses, still full, still perfect, untouched by any of the 200 guests who had been invited to celebrate with them. Nobody had touched them. Nobody was going to. Dominic Chase, with his hands bound behind him and 2 federal agents at his shoulders, looked around the tent with the expression of a man running a rapid inventory of available exits and finding none viable. What I watched on the camera feed in the next 30 seconds was the specific collapse that happens to people who have spent their entire lives constructing a version of themselves that requires an audience to maintain its structural integrity. Remove the audience's goodwill, and the construction comes apart at the joints. He found Patricia. She had moved from her position near the champagne tower when the agents entered and was standing now at the edge of the nearest table, one hand gripping its edge. She was wearing the champagne-colored dress and the borrowed diamond necklace, and the expression of a woman watching something she cannot yet fully understand, despite the fact that it is happening directly in front of her. She told me, Dominic said. His voice was loud and had abandoned its earlier social quality entirely. She planned the whole thing. Patricia's hand tightened on the table. She came to me, he continued, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had prepared this speech in advance, just in case it was ever needed. She told me her ex-husband was losing his capacity to manage his own affairs. She told me the property was under-leveraged and that nobody would look closely at who was running it. She told me what to say and who to call and how to structure the loan applications. Dominic, Patricia said. Her voice came out small and genuine, and therefore more painful to hear than anything she had said all evening. What are you saying? I was following her lead, Dominic said. She is the one who told me the trust documents could be worked around. She is the one who said Henry Calloway was too far gone to notice. Patricia walked toward him. Not dramatically, simply covering the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. I love you, she said. We are supposed to be getting married. Dominic looked at her. On the camera, I could see the precise moment when he stopped performing and simply said what was true. I was never going to marry you, he said. The room heard it. The tent had been silent since the handcuffs appeared, and silence carries certain things with a clarity that ordinary conversation cannot achieve. I needed the property address for the loan documents, he said. I needed someone with access to the distribution contacts. That was the arrangement. There was never anything else. Patricia stood there in her borrowed dress and absorbed what he had said the way certain soils absorb water, taking it in without any visible sign of what it was doing to what lay beneath. Then Owen moved. He had been standing frozen at the edge of the tent throughout this exchange, holding his empty champagne flute and looking between Dominic and the federal agents with the expression of a young man watching the architecture of his immediate future dissolve faster than his ability to process it. Let him go, Owen said, moving toward the agents. He said he was an investor. He said he was going to fund my company. This is a mistake. He reached the nearest agent and grabbed her sleeve. What happened next was not violent. It was simply physics. One of Victor Marsh's men stepped forward and applied a firm lateral force to Owen's shoulder. Owen had been moving with momentum and the slightly impaired balance of a man who had consumed several glasses of wine that evening. The combination produced a trajectory. Owen Calloway fell backward into the champagne tower. 200 crystal glasses came down in a cascade that took approximately 2 seconds and produced a sound that was spectacular, the comprehensive sound of a very large and expensive thing ceasing to exist all at once. Owen landed in the middle of it, in the wine and the broken crystal and the Sonoma clay that had worked up through the tent floor, and lay there in his well-fitted suit looking at the ceiling while the evening went completely silent around him. The guests left quickly after that. They did not leave in an organized way. They left in the way people leave when they have understood that staying will involve them in something they would prefer not to be involved in. Within 4 minutes, the tent held only Patricia, Owen on the floor, Victor Marsh and his men, the federal agents, and Francois Dubois, who was observing everything with the composed attention of a man who had traveled a long way to see something confirmed. A federal agent approached Patricia and reached for her left hand with the professional gentleness of someone who has done this before. "Ma'am," the agent said, "the ring on your finger is registered to a jewelry rental service. It appears on our evidence inventory." Patricia looked at the ring. She had worn it for 6 months. She had shown it to her friends and photographed it and understood it. I think, as confirmation that the choice she had made had been worth the price it required. She slid it off. She placed it in the agent's palm. She looked at her empty hand. Then she turned and looked directly at the camera mounted on the east tent pole. She looked at it the way a person looks at something, when they know that on the other side of it, someone is watching. She knew. She had always known where I put things, and what I would not allow to be invisible to me. I looked at her on my screen. She was standing in her champagne-colored dress with a smear of red clay near the hem, her hand empty where the ring had been, her hair partially loose, the evening arranged in ruins around her. I looked at her for a moment. Then I reached for my mouse and moved the cursor to the close button on the camera application. I clicked. The screen went dark. The harvest was done. The morning after the grand relaunch. I woke at 7 to the sound of the Duro below the Quinta and the smell of coffee that Isabel had left on the kitchen counter before walking down to her studio. The day was clear. A thin line of light was moving across the far hillside, finding the tops of the terraced vines, one row at a time, with the patient geometry of a sunrise that has done this before and sees no reason to rush. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and thought about the fact that it was Sunday morning in California, which meant it was Sunday morning at Callaway Vineyards, and that on Sunday mornings I had, for 34 years, walked the blocks before breakfast to read what the overnight temperature had done to the vines. I did not feel the urge to walk any blocks this morning. I felt the urge to sit with my coffee and let the light finish its work on the hillside without my involvement. At 8 in the morning Pacific time, which was 4 in the afternoon in Portugal, my attorney Marcus Stone sent me a brief message. It said that he had arrived at the property as scheduled and that the sheriff's department was present and that the eviction notice had been served. I read the message and put the phone down and poured a second cup of coffee. Marcus had told me the previous week what the process would look like. The trust violation clause, which I had written into the Callaway Family Agricultural Trust documents 19 years earlier with a different set of concerns in mind, was unambiguous. The clause stated that the primary residence and associated structures could not be used for commercial fraud, could not be used as collateral for debt instruments the trust had not authorized, and could not be modified in ways that materially diminished the assessed value of the agricultural assets without trustee approval. Dominic Chase's activities had violated all 3 provisions simultaneously, and had done so on camera, in the presence of federal agents, in front of 200 witnesses. The trust had automatically triggered a default review. Marcus had filed the necessary documentation. The court had issued the occupancy termination order that morning. Patricia and Owen had 30 minutes to remove personal property. I did not watch this part on the cameras. I had closed the feed the night before and I did not reopen it. Some things do not need to be witnessed. What I knew, from what Marcus described to me later, was that they took what they could carry. Clothing, primarily. A few personal items. Owen tried to take his gaming equipment and was informed by the deputy that electronics purchased with household funds and not accompanied by independent purchase receipts were considered property of the estate. He left it. Patricia took the winter coats from the hall closet and a photograph from the bedroom and the small ceramic dish on the kitchen counter, the turquoise one that Owen had made in pottery class when he was 9 years old, misshapen and imperfect, and one of the only objects in that house that had ever been made by someone in my family with their own hands. She took that. I was glad. Marcus told me that when they came out of the house for the last time, Owen walked directly to his car without stopping, and Patricia walked to the iron gate at the edge of the front garden and stood there for several minutes holding the bars and looking in. The garden where the old block had been was raw ground. The machinery had left it churned and uneven, the clay exposed in the way that clay looks when it has been disturbed after a long period of stability, dark and resentful and not yet healed. In the center of it you could still see where the oldest vine had stood. The root system had been deep enough that the extraction had left a substantial depression in the earth, a hole that the disturbed soil around it had only partially filled. Patricia stood at the gate and looked at that hole for a long time. I think about what she might have been remembering. We had been married for 34 years, which means that a great many mornings of her life had been spent in proximity to those vines. She had watched me work them. She had heard me talk about them. She had listened, with varying degrees of attention, to everything I had ever said about patience and rootstock, and what it means to tend something across decades rather than across seasons. I wonder if she remembered the afternoon we closed on the property 34 years ago, when I walked her up to the old block and put my hand on the oldest trunk and said what my father had said to me when I was learning. Old vines grow slow, I had told her, but what they make is worth the wait. I wonder if she understood, standing at that gate, looking at that hole, that I had been talking about more than the vines. She called me at 4:30 that afternoon, Portugal time. I was sitting on the terrace watching the river. I answered. She did not ask for anything. She did not ask for money or intervention or a second chance at an arrangement she had already spent. She said my name once, in the way people say a name when they are not sure what they want to follow it with. And then she said that she was sorry. I sat with that for a moment. You had a house, Patricia, I said. You had a family and a name that meant something in this industry, and 34 years of something that was not perfect, but was real. You traded it for a stage. I hope the performance was worth the ticket price. She did not respond. I did not wait for a response. I ended the call and placed the phone on the table and looked at the garden below the terrace, where Isabel had been earlier that afternoon, tending the herbs she kept in terracotta pots along the retaining wall. The rosemary and mint and thyme she had planted in the months since we had started spending time together, herbs that required attention, and returned it with the particular generosity of growing things that are well placed. The demolition is complete, I said to no one in particular. Now comes the real work. The sentence came down in March. I read about it on the website of the San Francisco Chronicle, in an article that Sarah Kim had contributed reporting to, a piece that ran with a photograph of Dominic Chase being walked from a federal courthouse in a suit that was not as well fitted as the one he had worn to the grand relaunch. 8 years in federal prison, wire fraud, aggravated food and beverage fraud, identity theft across 3 states. The judge had noted in her sentencing remarks that the defendant had shown no credible remorse and had attempted to implicate others in his offenses in a way the court found both transparent and unpersuasive. His assets at the time of sentencing totaled a leased vehicle that had been repossessed, a storage unit containing promotional materials for 7 different failed ventures, and a laptop computer. He went into the federal system owing money to the IRS, to Victor Marsh, to the catering company that had supplied the grand relaunch, and to approximately 14 other creditors whose claims were entered into the proceedings with varying degrees of documentation and identical outcomes. I read the article once. I did not read it again. I heard about Patricia from a mutual acquaintance who had seen her in Sonoma in February. She was working as a cashier at a grocery store on the eastern edge of town, the kind of store that sells practical things at practical prices to people who are living practical lives. She was on her feet 8 hours a day running items across a scanner and telling people their totals and thanking them for shopping there. The mutual acquaintance mentioned this with the specific tone of someone who expects the information to produce a reaction. It produced in me something more complicated than reaction. The acquaintance also mentioned, as a detail they thought I might find interesting or painful, or some combination of both, that Patricia was wearing a gold ring on her left hand. Not the diamond rental. Not anything Dominic Chase had provided. A simple gold band, plain and slightly worn, of the kind that costs very little and lasts a very long time. The acquaintance recognized it because they had attended our wedding 34 years ago, where Patricia had worn that ring for the first time. She had kept it in a jewelry box through everything. I had not known that. I did not know what to do with that information. So I set it in the same place I had learned to set things I could not resolve, in the quiet part of the mind, where unfinished questions sit until they either answer themselves or become irrelevant through the passage of time. I heard about Owen through the distribution network, specifically through a contact at a winery in Paso Robles named Calera Wine Estate, who mentioned in passing that they had taken on a new farmhand who said he had grown up in wine country and was trying to learn the business properly from the ground up. The contact described him as quiet and willing and a fast learner with the vines. I did not tell the contact that the farmhand was my son. The letter arrived in April. Marcus Stone forwarded it from my San Francisco address, where Owen had sent it because he no longer had another address for me. It came in a standard white envelope with my name, written on the front in handwriting I recognized immediately, though it looked different than I remembered, more deliberate, as though the person writing it was not in a hurry for the first time in a long while. Inside was a single sheet of paper torn from a spiral notebook, the cheap kind sold in drugstores, with faint blue lines and the rough edge of a page that has been removed by hand rather than cut. The handwriting covered both sides. "Dad," it began. I read the letter slowly at the kitchen table in the morning light. Owen wrote about his days at Calera. He wrote about the alarm at 5:30 and the drive to the estate in the dark, and the specific physical education of work that uses the body in ways that desk work and app development do not. He wrote about blisters and then about calluses and about the difference between them, which is that blisters hurt and calluses do not, and that the only way to get from one to the other is to keep going through the pain rather than stopping because of it. He wrote that he had been assigned to the rootstock blocks in February, and that the foreman had spent an afternoon teaching him how to read a vine for signs of stress and how to adjust irrigation based on soil moisture rather than schedule. He wrote that he had recognized some of what the foreman was showing him, not from his own experience but from somewhere in the back of his memory, some afternoon in a Sonoma vineyard when he was small and a man was explaining the same things in the same tone, and he had not been paying attention because he had not yet understood that the things worth paying attention to do not announce themselves. He wrote about the terroir. "I finally understand what that word actually means," he wrote. "I used to think it was marketing language, a way to charge more for wine from certain places. I understand now that it is not about place. It is about what honest hands put into a place over time. It is the accumulated result of people who cared about something beyond the current season. You tried to show me that. I had dirt in my eyes. He did not ask for anything. He did not request money or contact or forgiveness or any of the things that letters from children to estranged parents typically request when they have been written to produce a specific response. He simply described his life and what he was learning from it and said that he thought I should know. At the end, he wrote, 'I hope wherever you are, the vines are good.' He signed it with his name. Just his name. I folded the letter carefully, following the creases he had already made, and I held it for a moment in both hands. Then I opened the third drawer of the kitchen desk and placed it inside, in the section where I keep documents that matter without yet knowing in what way or when. I did not call him. I did not write back. There is a principle in construction called cure time. Concrete that has been poured must be allowed to set completely before any load is applied to it. Interrupt the curing process and you get a surface that appears solid but will crack under pressure because the molecular structure beneath has not been given enough time to achieve its full integrity. The kindest thing you can do for new concrete is to leave it alone. Owen was pouring a new foundation. It was slow and it was hard, and it was exactly what the situation required. If I stepped in now with money or advice or the particular comfort of a father telling a son that everything was going to be all right, I would be applying load before the cure was complete. I would be weakening the very thing I wanted to see become strong. I closed the drawer. I made a second cup of coffee and took it out to the terrace and sat with it while the morning finished, arriving over the Douro Valley. One ridge at a time, unhurried and reliable and completely indifferent to whether I was watching. The ribbon cutting for the Callaway Institute of Viticulture was not a grand affair. There was no red carpet. There were no rented diamonds, no champagne tower, no investors being pitched to over wine that was not what it claimed to be. There was construction dust that had not quite settled, and the smell of fresh paint, and the particular acoustic quality of a large room that has just been finished and has not yet learned what it sounds like when it is full of people doing what it was built for. There were 40 students. They came from the villages along the Douro, from Pinhao and Regua, and the smaller settlements in between, ranging in age from 16 to 32. Most of them from farming families, many of them the children of vineyard workers who had tended other people's land for generations, without ever being taught the systematic knowledge that separates labor from craft. They stood in the workshop in small groups, looking at the equipment with the specific attention of people who recognize tools and are trying to understand what they are for. I cut the ribbon with a pair of pruning shears, not ceremonial scissors. The actual shears I used in the vineyard, worn at the pivot and sharpened to the precise angle I had learned from my father. The applause was genuine. It was the applause of people who are glad something exists, not of people who are glad to be seen attending it. Isabel stood near the back of the room. She was not in the front row, because she had not wanted to be in the front row, which is one of the things about her I have come to rely on without expecting to. She caught my eye when I looked for her, and she nodded once. The nod of someone who knows that the moment is complete and does not need to be elaborated upon. I spoke briefly. I said that what we were building here was not a school in the conventional sense. It was a transfer. 40 years of knowledge, moving from one set of hands to another set of hands. I said that the most important things I had ever learned about wine and about land and about the relationship between patience and quality had not come from books or laboratories. They had come from standing in a vineyard for long enough that the vineyard started telling me things. I said that I hoped these students would stand in their vineyards long enough to hear the same. Afterward, when the students had gone home, and the instructors had locked the workshop, and the afternoon had settled into the golden quietness that the Douro does better than almost anywhere I have ever been, I walked back to the Quinta with Isabel, and we sat on the terrace, and I poured 2 glasses of a local wine we had been slowly working through, and we sat in the kind of companionable silence that does not need to be filled. I have thought often, in the months since the grand relaunch, about the nature of what I did. People use the word revenge for it when they describe it to each other. I have heard the word applied to my situation by people who find the sequence of events satisfying in the way that certain stories are satisfying, where a wrong is corrected, and the people responsible for it receive the consequences of their choices in a way that feels proportionate and final. But that is not what happened. I did not destroy Dominic Chase. His own dishonesty destroyed him, as dishonesty always eventually does when the accounting comes due. I did not ruin Patricia's life. She made a series of choices, and she is living with what those choices produced, which is not punishment but simply consequence, the physics of character applied across time. I did not take Owen's future from him. I left it entirely in his hands, which is where futures belong. What I did was simpler and harder than revenge. I removed the scaffolding. I stopped holding up a structure that had been leaning on me for decades while telling me it did not need me. When you remove the false support from something that was never truly standing on its own, it comes down. That is not an act of destruction. That is an act of honesty. The land always tells the truth eventually. So does the removal of what was propping up the lie. I am grateful for that understanding. I am grateful. In the way that a person is grateful when they have been given more time than they expected and have found something worth using it for. That I came to Portugal when I did. I believe, and I do not say this lightly because it is not my habit to say things lightly, that God places certain valleys in certain lives at certain times for reasons that become clear only in the looking back. This valley, this river, this woman sitting beside me with paint on her left hand and a wine glass in her right, was not where I planned to be at 68. I am convinced it is precisely where I was meant to arrive. And I am grateful. In the deepest and least complicated way I know how to be grateful, that I did not miss it. We went to the garden after the sun had moved behind the western ridge. There was a section of the Quinta's small vineyard that I had been preparing for several weeks, a south-facing slope with good drainage and the schist bedrock close to the surface. I had brought 6 rooted cuttings from a nursery in Davis, shipped through a colleague, cleared through agricultural import, carefully maintained through the transit. They were small. The stems were no thicker than my finger. They looked, in the diminishing light of the Douro evening, like something that required considerable faith in the future. Isabel knelt beside the first hole I had dug and looked at the cutting I was holding. "What are you planting?" she asked. "Callaway clone," I said. "But Portuguese now." She smiled. She took the cutting from my hands and held it the way she holds her clay, with the particular attention of someone who understands that the thing in their hands is not yet what it is going to become. She placed it in the hole. I steadied it while she pressed the earth around the base with both palms, firm and even, the way you set something you intend to stay. We planted all 6 that evening. When we were done, we stood and looked at the row of them in the last of the light. 6 small, improbable things in Portuguese schist that were, if everything went as it should, the beginning of something that would outlast both of us. "Good wine takes time," I said. Isabel brushed the soil from her hands. "So does a good life." I looked at the 6 cuttings. I looked at the river below. I thought about an 80-year-old vine with its roots exposed in the November light, and about a notebook page that said I had dirt in my eyes, and about a woman who had once said that a thing could taste like someone had actually meant it. For the first time in 68 years, I had all the time in the world, and someone worth sharing it with. If this story reached you, if something in Henry's journey reflected something in your own life, I would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me what you are building, and whether the people around you understand the value of what you have made. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please consider doing so. These reflections are offered not for sympathy, but because lived experience, even difficult experience, can sometimes light the way for someone else walking a similar path. God bless you. Build wisely. And never forget that the strongest foundation you will ever pour is the one beneath your own feet.